Hey everyone! Today I want to share a new story with you. Enjoy watching. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a mistake. Maybe I had forgotten my lunch at home. The second time, I convinced myself that I had simply misplaced it in the wrong section of the office fridge. But by the third, fourth, and fifth disappearances, I could no longer deny it. Someone was stealing my lunches. I stood in front of the break room fridge, my stomach growling, scanning the shelves as if my neatly packed container might magically reappear. But no! Once again, my meal had vanished. My fists clenched at my sides. Who could do something like this? And more importantly, why? Looking for something? Verity asked, one of my few tolerable colleagues. She leaned casually against the counter, sipping her tea. My lunch, I muttered frustrated. Again, someone's been taking it. Verity raised her eyebrows in disbelief. Seriously? That's awful. You should label it. I do, I said, exasperated, with a bright red marker. My name's right there on the lid. Doesn't stop them. Verity frowned. You know, Francis has been hanging around the fridge a lot lately. I saw him yesterday, stuffing a sandwich into his mouth like he was hiding something. Francis. The name alone sent a wave of irritation through me. He was notorious for being rude, dismissive, and wielding his managerial power like a weapon. The type of person who took credit for others' ideas and never owned up to his mistakes. A lunch thief? It fit. That evening, I came up with a plan. The next day, I arrived early, prepared my lunch, and boldly marked it with an unmistakable warning. Do not touch. A challenge. Then I waited. By noon, I lingered near the break room, pretending to scroll through my phone, all the while keeping one eye on the fridge. Then, as if on cue, Francis strolled in. He glanced around before yanking open the fridge door. His eyes briefly flickered to my lunch. I held my breath. His hand shot out. He grabbed my container and, without even checking, popped it open, scooping out a forkful of pasta. I stepped forward, my pulse racing. Enjoying my lunch, Francis? My voice cut through the quiet hum of the break room. He startled, but quickly recovered, smirking. Oh, I thought it was mine. Same container. Easy mistake, right? So, you're telling me you've been accidentally stealing my lunch for the past 2 weeks? Francis shrugged, chewing without a hint of remorse. Maybe you should pick a different lunchbox. My nails dug into my palm. This wasn't just theft, it was entitlement. I had caught him red-handed, and he didn't care. Worse, he acted like I was the one at fault. Unbelievable, I muttered, turning on my heel and marching out. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. That night, I lay awake, tossing and turning, boiling with frustration. Francis had not only stolen my lunch again, but he had the audacity to brush me off as if I were the problem. My stomach churned, not just from hunger but from sheer indignation. It was time to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. The plan had to be flawless. At lunch break the next day, I walked into the office kitchen, carrying my neatly packed lunchbox. Inside was a generous serving of homemade mashed potatoes, tender slices of roasted chicken, and, as the piece de resistance, rich, thick gravy laced with a heavy dose of laxative powder, just enough to make him suffer, but not enough to land me in legal trouble. I carefully placed the container in the fridge, making sure it was positioned exactly where my lunches always seemed to disappear. Then I left, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary. The anticipation gnawed at me like a persistent itch. I glanced at the clock, waiting for Francis to make his move. And then it happened. From my desk, I saw him swagger into the kitchen, his usual smugness on full display. He barely checked his surroundings before yanking my container from the fridge. My pulse quickened. I held my breath as he opened it and inhaled deeply, muttering to himself. Finally, something decent around here, he muttered to himself. My fingers tightened around the pen in my hand as I watched him devour the meal at his desk, completely unaware of the trap he had walked into. The urge to smirk was tempting, but I resisted. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. 15 minutes passed, then 20. I began to notice a change in Francis's demeanor. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face twitching ever so slightly. He took a long gulp of water, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The first signs of discomfort. A low groan slipped from his lips as he pressed a hand to his stomach. Without warning, he shot up from his seat, nearly knocking his keyboard to the floor. His face drained of color. "Oh, God!" he muttered. "Oh, no!" And just like that, he bolted out of the office. The entire room watched as Francis practically sprinted toward the restroom, one hand clutching his stomach and the other flailing for balance. The door slammed shut behind him. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Sweet, sweet justice. For the next hour, the only sound emerging from the restroom was a series of anguished groans. Colleagues exchanged amused glances while I pretended to be absorbed in my work, though inside, I was basking in victory. Francis had stolen from me one too many times, and today he had finally paid the price. The summons came precisely at 9:30 a.m., an email with a cold, impersonal subject line. Meeting with HR, immediate attendance required. A sharp pulse of anxiety hit me. My plan had worked too well. Francis must have suffered enough to drag me into this mess. I grabbed my notepad, squared my shoulders, and strode into the HR office. Ms. Ellsworth, the head of HR, sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. Francis was already there, slumped in a chair. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked completely wrecked. "Verity," Ms. Ellsworth began, folding her hands. "Francis has raised a concern about food tampering. He believes you deliberately spiked a lunch that he mistakenly ate." I almost laughed. "Mistakenly?" I said smoothly. "I wasn't aware that my lunch belonged to Francis." His face tightened. "You knew I'd take it," he snapped. "You did it on purpose. Poisoning a colleague is a serious offense." I leaned forward slightly. "So, you're admitting that you've been stealing my lunch?" Ms. Ellsworth sighed. "The issue isn't about past incidents. It's about your response. This is a workplace, not a battlefield." I clenched my fist under the table. "So, you're telling me I should just let him keep stealing from me?" "I'm saying retaliation wasn't the right approach," she replied. "Moving forward, I suggest you lock your lunches away." Francis waved a dismissive hand. Yeah, I'll bring my own food." That was it. A wrist slap. I exhaled sharply. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Francis thought he'd won, but I wasn't finished. The moment HR dismissed me with their pathetic lock your lunch solution, a new idea formed. This time, I wouldn't just humiliate him. I'd make sure he'd never dare touch my food again. That night, I carefully prepared my new masterpiece. Soft, buttery mashed potatoes, inviting and smooth, but hidden within was a mix of earthworms and a couple of roaches. Their dark shells blended seamlessly into the creamy texture. The mere thought made my stomach turn, but for Francis, it would be the perfect punishment. Morning arrived, and I placed the bait in the fridge. But I needed proof. Before stepping away, I carefully adjusted a small hidden camera in front of the fridge. Its lens was positioned to capture everything. An hour passed, then two. Finally, Francis strolled into the break room, glancing around before opening the fridge. I watched from my hidden vantage point, ready for the next phase of my planned MY heart race as I watched the live feed on my phone. Francis grabbed my container and peeled back the lid, probably thinking he'd won again. He dug in without hesitation, but then paused, a slow chew, before his face contorted in disgust. "Oh, God!" Francis shot up from his chair, gagging violently. The chair crashed behind him as he sprinted toward the restroom, retching and cursing. The office fell into stunned silence before it exploded into whispers. A satisfied smile tugged at my lips as I watched it unfold. But the real triumph? The footage. It captured everything. Francis's theft, his humiliation. It was all there. By lunchtime, I would have the evidence HR couldn't ignore. This time, he wouldn't get away with it. This time, he was finished. I replayed the footage over and over, each loop filling me with deeper satisfaction. There he was, caught red-handed, stealing my lunch. He took a huge bite, only to twist in horror when he realized what he'd actually eaten. The gagging, the panic, and his wild dash to the restroom. It was perfect, undeniable. By noon, the office was buzzing. Some claimed Francis was still in the restroom, moaning in agony. Others whispered that he had turned a strange shade of green. But I had bigger plans. Clutching my USB drive, I walked into HR's office. Hannah, the same representative from before, looked up with a flat expression. "You again?" she sighed. I slid the drive across the desk. "Play it," I said coolly. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant, but she complied. As the footage unfolded, I saw her face change, shock, discomfort, and then realization. This is bad," she murmured. "For him," I replied. "I expect consequences." She swallowed, clearly struggling. "We'll review?" "No," I interrupted. "You told me to lock up my food instead of holding him accountable. I did one better. I caught him in the act. This isn't just lunch theft. This is workplace misconduct. If you let him off the hook, you're complicit." Hannah pressed her lips together in a thin line. I could tell she was backed into a corner. By afternoon, an email was sent to the entire office. Effective immediately, Francis is placed on suspension pending investigation. I expected quiet satisfaction, maybe even a bit of relief. But what I got instead was an eruption. Whispers turned into full-blown conversations. People shared stories of how Francis had bullied interns, how he'd taken credit for others' work. HR was suddenly flooded with complaints. 2 days later, another email arrived. Francis's employment has been terminated, effective immediately. It turned out that my revenge had only been the tipping point. HR couldn't ignore the flood of reports anymore. As I packed up my things to head home that evening, I glanced at the break room fridge. The door stood ajar, its shelves filled with neatly labeled lunches. No missing meals, no theft. Justice had been served. So, friends, what do you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you like more stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss any future videos. See you tomorrow.